Now, in the last lesson, we looked at how we can run code inside our EJS templates. Now, in this lesson, I want to continue building out the functionality of what is our main goal, right? Making a to-do list app. So inside our app.js, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to use this massive switch statement to convert this day from 0, 1, 2, 3 into the actual name, say Sunday, Monday, Tuesday? Wouldn't it be great if we could just use JavaScript to do that? Well, let's see if it's possible. So if you go into Google and we search for something, for example, JavaScript date format, then if you take a look at this highly relevant Stack Overflow post, which says, how can I format a JavaScript date to print in a specific way, then you can see that there's a whole bunch of answers. And the accepted answer actually has this part where it says this answer was written in 2010 and there's better answers below. And that better answer is actually this one. There's a method called toLocale dateString that allows you to format your JavaScript using whichever format you wish. So for example, you can include a day as numeric or 2-digit. Then you can have a weekday, which can be narrow, short, or long, and you can have it for different languages. So if you take a look at their example, they've created this variable called options, which has a number of properties. So weekday is set as long, year is set as numeric, month is long, day is numeric. Then they've created a new date and they've called this method on that date, rendering it in a US English format, which looks like this without the options, and with the options included, it looks like this. So this is pretty much what we want. And so we're going to borrow this and add it to our code. So firstly, we have to create our options, and this is going to be a JavaScript object. And in our date, I want to have a weekday to begin with. And my weekday, the option I'm going to set is going to be long. I want to write out the entire day of the week. Weekday, which is going to be long. And the next thing is day, which is going to be numeric. And finally, we're going to add that month, which is going to be long as well. So now we have our options object. We're going to use it to render our date. So let's create our var day. And this is going to be equal to today dot toLocale dateString. And you can see that this converts a date to a string, returning the date portion using the operating system's locales conventions. And of course, that means that you have to add in the locale, which is basically a region. And we're going to use something like English US. So en-US. And if you want that date string to be rendered in Japanese or Chinese, then you can change that to the relevant locale. So en-US, and then we're going to pass in our options to format that date string. So now if we hit save, then this formatted day gets passed in here, which gets sent over to our list.ejs as a variable called kind of day. And now to clear this part up as well, instead of having this code that checks for the kind of day, I'm going to have a really simple h1 that just logs that date string inside an h1. So I'm just going to put kind of day inside this tag. So now if we hit refresh, then you can see that we get our formatted string, Thursday, June the 7th. And now that we've tidied up our code a little bit, we can get on with building out the rest of our to-do list. So the simplest form of our to-do list is simply an unordered list with a bunch of list items. So this will generate us a bunch of bullet points with each of our to-do list items. So first one will be buy food. Then we'll have one called, then of course you have to cook the food. And my favorite part, which is eat the food. Now, look at the clock. It's almost lunchtime, and guess what I'm thinking about? So this, if we hit save, will render our web page as a bunch of bullet points. So now we want to be able to add new items to this list. And in order to do that, we need to pass data back from our web page to our server. And how have we been doing that so far? Post requests, of course. So as a challenge, I want you to create a new form inside your list.ejs, just as you have been doing before inside your index.htmls. And this form is going to have a single text input that is going to take whatever value the user puts in there as the next to-do list item. And then when you hit the submit button, it's going to make a post request to the home route. So to complete the first part of the challenge, I just want you to create the form that is going to make the post request inside our list.ejs in the same way that you have been doing it before inside your other HTML pages. So pause the video and give that a go. All right, so we start off by creating a new form, and I'm going to keep the class empty for now, and I'm going to change the action to our home route, which is that /, or also known as the root route. But I find root route a bit of a tongue twister, so I'm going to continue calling it the home route. But I'm sure you understand what I'm talking about. So the method I'm going to keep as post, which is going to post the information that's inside my form to my server at the home route. So now inside the form, we're going to add a single input that is going to have type text, and the name of this input, we'll just call it new item. And I'm going to delete the value because the value is going to be whatever the user inputs into that text field. And finally, I need to add a button which has a type of submit so that it will trigger this post request in the form to this route. And the name I'm going to keep as button, but the button is going to have a title of add. So now if we hit save and we refresh our page, we've now got an input where I can put in anything I want. And when I press add, of course, nothing happens. And we get this error saying cannot post to the home route. And that is because we have yet to write the code in our server to handle that post request. So you know what's coming. There's another challenge. So inside your app.js, I want you to write some code that handles the post request to the home route and just console log the text that the user wrote into that input. So pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so as always, we start off by writing app.post to handle post requests that go to a particular route. And the route in this case that we want to handle is the one to the home route. And when that does happen, we're going to trigger a callback with a request and a response. And inside our callback, we're going to grab the value of what's inside our text box. So remember, we gave our text box a name of new item, and that's equivalent to the name of a variable. And we can tap into that value by tapping into request.body.newItem. But before we can use this thing called body, we of course have to set up body parser. Now you can write this anywhere below we create our app, but I'm just going to add it between the set and the get. So I'm going to say app.use body parser .url encoded, and we're going to set the extended option as true. Now, it doesn't really matter if you set it as true or false in our case, but you do have to give it a value. So now that we've told our app to use body parser, we can now grab the value of new item using this line request.body.newItem. So we can either save this into a variable called item and then console log it, or you can of course simply place this inside here and remove the need for that extra line. So let's just review what happens when we press the submit button. our form is going to make a post request to the home route, and it's going to post the value of our text input, which has a name of new item. Now, when that request is received, it gets caught inside this app.post section. And we tap into the request, looking through the body of the post request, and we search for the value of something called new item. So this has to match up with the name of our input in order to retrieve the value of that text input. And then we log the value of item. So let's hit save and let's try and give it a go. Let's go back to localhost 3000 and let's add a new item. Let's press add. And now if we go into our hyper terminal, you can see that the value of that text input gets logged inside our console. So brilliant, that's now working. So on to the next thing that we need to do. So we've now passed the data from our web page to our server, but we now need to pass the data back into our web page, namely into a new list item inside the UL. So we can start doing that by creating a new list item, and its content is going to be a EJS tag that is going to render new list item. So now we just have to pass in that new list item. Now, some of you might think that you could do it inside the post request. So for example, you could say res.render, just as we did up here, and we render our list template and we pass in our item. So remember, the variable name was called new list item. So I'm just going to copy it and put it in here as the key. And then the value is going to be equal to the value of our variable item. So I'm just going to write that inside here. So we're going to render the list template and we're going to pass in this. Now there's a bit of a problem here because right now, if you save everything, if you save your app.js and your list.js and you try to refresh this page, you will get an error. And it tells you that inside your list.ejs on line 17, there is a problem. And line 17 is where we are trying to render our new list item. And the problem is that new list item is not defined. This is because when we try to go to localhost 3000, i.e. our home route, then we land inside this block of code. And you can see that when we're trying to render list, we're only passing in the value for this variable kind of day. And we're not passing in anything for new list item. So when it tries to render list at this point, then it doesn't actually have a value to put into this new list item EJS tag. And that is why our app crashes. So we now know that every single time you try to render list, we have to provide both variables that we want to render. So to fix this, then we would probably want to add our new list item over to this res.render. And we're going to call it exactly the same as what we have in our template page, which is new list item. And we're going to pass in the value of this item that we've got over here. And inside our post request, instead of trying to res.render, we're simply going to say res.redirect. And we're going to redirect to our home route. So what this does is when a post request is triggered on our home route, we'll save the value of new item inside that text box to a variable called item, and it will redirect to the home route, which then gets us over here and triggers the app.get for our home route, and it will res.render the list template, passing in both the kind of day as well as the new list item. Now it's a little bit convoluted and it's quite roundabout, so you might have to play around with this code in order to fully understand what's going on. But we now have another problem. So if I hit save and I refresh our page, you can see that it says that item is not defined. And that's telling you that in your app.js on line 26, item is not defined. So on this line, at this point, it can't access this variable called item because item was created inside the post route. In fact, item only exists when we make a post request to our server. So once the users type something into that text box, do we actually create this variable called item? If we're trying to pass it in here when it doesn't exist, that's why we get this particular error. And this problem is related to something that we call scope in programming. And in the next lesson, we're going to be exploring scope in more detail. But let me show you how you can fix this. Instead of having our variable created over here, we can create our variable at the top of our file. So let's create this item variable and let's set it to equal nothing. So an empty string. And when we do receive a post request, then we reset the item variable to whatever it is that the user typed into the text box. So for some of you guys, you might have spotted that if we write our code like this, we'll have a bit of a problem because whenever we create a new post request, then we replace the value of this item variable and this li becomes the latest item. So let me show you what I mean. So you can see the last item in our list is eat more food. If I add another one, say another, and I hit add, then it replaces our last item instead of what we want, which is to add another li below the previous one. So essentially, our code at the moment only lets us store one piece of data under this variable called item, and the old ones will get overwritten. So what we need is to store our items in a collection. So let's create an array. So instead of having our variable being item, let's call it items. And this is now going to be an array. And it's going to start out being empty. But every single time we get a new post request and we create a new variable called item, then we can append that item to our array called items. So items.push. And the object we want to push is the new item that we got from our post request. And when we pass it over to render our list view, then we're going to pass over our entire array. So now if we hit save and refresh, you can see that we have a new problem. Instead of creating new LIs, we're simply just rendering our array inside the single li. And that's because if we have a look inside our list.ejs, all it's doing is just planting whatever it is that we got sent over inside this list item element. And so if new list item happens to be an array, then all of that just gets put in here and rendered as a single list item, which is not what we want. We want them to be all separate list items, and we want to create new LIs for every single new item we add to our list. So what we would need to happen is when we pass over an array or a collection like this, we want to loop through it and create a new li for each item inside the array. So essentially, we would need to create a for loop. So here's a challenge. I want you to replace this line of code with a for loop using the EJS snippets that we learned about in the last lesson so that we can loop through all of the items in the array, and we're going to create a single li that contains every single item inside this array. So by the end of it, you should be able to add new LIs every single time you type a new to-do list item. All right, so let's give this a go. Let's comment this line out, and in its place, we're going to write a for loop. So if we're going to create a new traditional for loop, then we're going to create a variable called I that's going to start off being equal to 0, and it's going to run while I is less than the new list item array dot length. And finally, I is going to be incremented by 1 each time. And at this point, it's probably a good idea to change the name of this to reflect the fact that it's now an array. It's not a single item anymore. So let's go ahead and change this to new list items. And remember, that means we have to change it here as well. And now we're going to create an li that is going to be new list items at the index of I. So these lines of code loops through our array, and for however many items there are in there, we're going to create a list item for each of them. So remember, in order to run code inside our EJS file, we of course have to add the snippets tag on each line where we have some code. And inside the li, we're going to render the value of new list items at index I. So we're going to use a slightly different tag, which is the one that is a angle bracket %sign equals, in order to get the value of new list item at index I. So let's delete our previous line of code and let's refresh our page. And now if I add a new item, then you can see that for every single new item I have, it will get added in to our UL, and each item gets its own li. Now we can make our code even more succinct by simply deleting all of these li's, and instead we simply add it to our array. So our array starts off with 3 items: buy food, cook food, and eat food. And all 3 items inside the items array will get loaded up into its own li as soon as we load up the page. And when we add new items, then it will get added to the end of the list. So now our for loop takes care of rendering everything into a new li, and it renders every single item that we add into our items array. So to summarize, when we first load up our home page, we go through this route and we render our list.ejs, passing in 2 variables, one called kind of day and another called new list items. Now, new list items is set to equal the items array, which starts off containing 3 strings: buy food, cook food, eat food. And this gets passed into the list.ejs under this variable name new list items. And over here we have a for loop that loops through the entire length of the new list items array, and it renders a new li for each item inside the array. Now, when a user adds a new item through the text input, then that gets saved under the variable name new item, and we trigger a post request to the home route, which will be caught by this block of code. And when we're inside this block of code, we grab hold of the value of the new item, so whatever it is that the user typed inside here, and then we save it to a variable called item, and we add that item to our array called items. And then we redirect to the home route. So now we go back over here, but the items array has now increased by a size of 1, and our new item gets pushed onto the end of the array. And now we're able to go ahead and render list again and pass over the now updated array with all of our list items. So this is a really fundamental part of templating, and that is passing data through from the server to our template and populating it with dynamic content. So if this is at all confusing, I recommend trying it yourself. So trying to build the website as we have it right now by yourself without watching the videos. So it might take a couple of goes, and you might have to come back to the videos to refresh yourself and remind yourself of how things are done, but this requires a little bit of repetition on your part and playing around with the code, passing in different things, looping through it, or using if statements, using for statements on the EJS side and rendering it inside the template. But after you're done, in the next lesson, we're going to talk about a concept in programming known as scope. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.